Yeah, okay, great. Awesome. Well, we're probably just going to get started then. I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. Okay. Hopefully you can see this. Hi, everyone. My name is David Borish. I'm a researcher and a filmmaker from Southern Ontario, but I've been working with Inuit in Labrador, Canada for really the past 5+ years on a project called Heard Inuit Voices on Caribou, which has been an incredible experience all about this story of people and caribou in Labrador. And this is something that we're just starting to share to the world right now. And I'm really excited to share a little bit about this project, what we've been working on, and where we're at. And hopefully it'll be of use and of value for some of you on the kind of co-creation and visual media side of working with Indigenous communities. So, as a starting point, this is a map of Canada, but I think a lot of people don't fully know that there's a whole other kind of part of Canada, that's Inuit Nunangat. These are the Inuit homelands within Canada, and within Inuit Nunangat, there are a variety of different places. There's Nunavut, which many people know of. There's Inuvialuit. There's Nunavik. And then in Labrador, there is Nunatsiavut, which is the northern portion of Labrador. And then not on this map, but related is Nunatuvut, which is mainly central and southern Labrador. And this is really the region that we've been working in, the Nunatsiavut and the Nunatuvut regions of eastern Canada in Labrador. And this is an interesting place because Inuit in these regions have shared a deep and enduring relationship with caribou for many, many generations. Caribou are an integral source of culture, of food security, of connections to the land, and connections within communities and families. That this animal is really at the core of Inuit life. And in Labrador, one of the biggest herds in the world only a few decades ago, back in the 1990s, was the George River caribou herd. And this herd numbered somewhere around 800,000 animals, like I said, just a few decades ago. So a massive population. But since then, this George River herd has been on a steady decline. It's estimated that since 2001, the herd has declined by 99%, meaning that the herd is now somewhere around 8,000 animals. So just a complete decline. And really, not a whole lot is fully understood about why the herd has declined. Caribou populations go through natural cycles over periods of decades. Back in the 1950s, the same herd was at a relatively low number, and then it shot up in population and then shot right back down. But now there's a bunch of other potential unnatural effects, such as climate change, human developments that might be playing a role in this, but really no one fully understands the reasons why the caribou herds have been declining in these ways. But in response, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador enacted a total hunting ban on all caribou in Labrador in 2013, which has meant that no one, not even Inuit, have been legally allowed to hunt caribou for almost a decade now. And although there were, good intentions to enact this ban, Inuit felt as though their experiences, their voices were not being recognized when making these kinds of environmental decision-making processes. So Inuit felt as though they needed to share their voices and to express their knowledge in relationship to these declines. And so that's really the start of this film project that was all about trying to work with Inuit communities to share their perspectives. And a steering committee was put together with representatives from a diversity of different groups. This project is led by members from the Nunatsiavut government, the Nunatsiavut Community Council, the Torngat Wildlife Plants and Fisheries Secretariat, which is an Inuit co-management board in the region, as well as different members from academic institutions, such as myself being associated with the University of Guelph through my doctoral work. And it was the collective vision of this steering committee to work towards supporting Inuit voices and amplifying them so that they could be understood and represented. And so the main goal of this project was to characterize the ways that the changing caribou populations were impacting Inuit health and well-being and all through the co-creation of community-based documentary film. Documentary film was the front and center of this project. And we had this incredible opportunity of working across Labrador to interview people across 11 different communities, from the northern community in Nain all the way down south to St. Louis in the Nunatsiavut region. We went to a lot of different places. And within these communities, we talked to over 80 people through in-depth filmed interviews. So lots of people, lots of knowledge. And the goal was not to talk to just one specific group of people, but instead a diversity of different perspectives in relationship to caribou. So we talked to hunters, we talked to elders, we talked to cooks, we talked to people that carved caribou antlers. We talked to youth who had, in some cases, never even eaten or seen caribou before. So we wanted to collect a variety of different perspectives for this film and for this research project. And just a bit of background in terms of getting to some of these communities. It's not like there's road access to all these different communities along the coast. So really the ways that people get around for the most part is either flying into these communities or in the winter traveling by skidoo. And so we did that a variety of times, going from one community to the next over, ice and trails and things like that. So these are fairly remote, isolated communities in northern Labrador. And as mentioned, documentary film was really the front and center of our work. And so we took very much a visual approach. And this visual approach was to align mainly with Inuit priorities of sharing Inuit voices in ways that also aligned with their oral histories, their storytelling backgrounds, and their abilities to share information through non-text means. And so we ended up focusing on really two main things through this visual approach: filming people and filming caribou. And when filming caribou, it was all about the co-creation process. So it's not like I just went and filmed caribou by myself. I went with a team of Inuit members as well as others to go out and film caribou. So this is one example. This is actually our very first film trip in 2018, when we traveled north of Nain to film caribou with Inuit knowledge holder Henry Lyle from Nain, as well as Eldred Allen, an Inuit drone operator from Rigolet. And we were able to capture some really incredible footage of caribou that day. When filming people, this was also very much a co-creation process. I traveled to all the communities and interviewed all the participants with Ina Shaiwak, who's one of my colleagues. She's an Inuit researcher from Rigolet, Nunatsiavut. And we would kind of go back and forth asking questions to people. She would focus on certain questions, I would focus on others, and I'd mainly be behind the camera. And this is the way that we were able to collect a bunch of important knowledge from participants. And because we were filming it, rather than just doing regular interviews, what people were doing and where they were was really important. So we encouraged people to do things that they felt comfortable with. And in many cases, people, while they were talking to us, they were doing things that were connected to their relationship with caribou, whether that was carving, whether that was sewing, whether it was out on the land, maybe cooking. And this was part of the process of learning about caribou through these kinds of interactive means. Once we had all of this information, we had a ton of video data to go through and knowledge. And we needed to do multiple things. One was to create the film, but the other was to work on research pieces and reports and academic articles. And so what we did was we ended up repurposing video editing software for qualitative analysis. And just to go over this briefly, we were able to connect transcripts directly to video interviews, which meant that we could take any part of the transcript, a sentence, a paragraph, and that would be directly connected to that part of the video interview. And we could apply codes to that text, which was then in turn connected directly to the video interviews. So in this way, we were using video not only as a communication process, but also as a form of data to explore about Inuit connections to caribou. And a really important part of this process, again, was this co-creation aspect, this idea that we were community-based and working with people across Labrador to collectively tell this story. And so one of the things we did was we held open houses to engage participants as well as other community members. So once we went around and interviewed people, we attached some of their quotes to their visuals and shared them through things like this mini photo exhibit in the community of Rigolet, where community members could go by and read what participants were saying, and they could provide feedback to us on, is this in alignment with their views of Caribou, or is this something that we should emphasize more in the film? And all this was really important for putting the film together. So based on this process of, the visual aspects, the research aspects, the co-creation aspects with community members, we had heard a lot of different Inuit experiences with caribou as well as the caribou population declines. And these are some of the things that I'm going to be showing you right now, actually. But it was really important for us, again, to not just take what people were saying and then share it out in text formats. We wanted to provide opportunities for people to speak for themselves. And so from a few individuals about their specific relationships with caribou.
The caribou meat was, I suppose you would call it the staple. We had that every day, almost always every day, caribou meat.
People across Labrador talked about how important it was that caribou was this food source, something that people ate on a regular basis. It was largely considered to be a staple food, something that in some cases people had almost every single day. So it was clearly this integral source of well-being from that food side. But it wasn't just the quantity of caribou that was eaten. It was also that caribou was a healthy source of food, a culturally appropriate source, and a diverse source in the sense that you could make so many different dishes with caribou. One of the questions that we asked people was, what's your favorite way to cook this meat? And people talked about soups, they talked about stews, they talked about niku and dried caribou. They talked about so many different ways of them actually eating this animal. And that was part of the celebratory process of thinking about how important this food source is for their own well-being. But it wasn't just caribou as a food source that people talked about.
Do the Inuit culture is important because they're a part of the land, and living out here like this, on this land like this, not too far from here, they share the land with the humans out here and people. It's part of their lifestyle with the caribou in their life.
So again, caribou, very important from this food side, this kind of tangible side, but there were also a lot of intangible connections to this animal. And people talked about how caribou was part of their lifestyle. It was part of their culture, their cultural practices of going out on the land, of learning how to hunt and prepare the meat a certain way, of preparing the clothing or potentially, the antlers for different tools and art. Caribou was a really, really important part of people's culture. And tied with that, again, is these traditions and this knowledge that has been passed on through the generations. It wasn't just going on a caribou hunt. It was about passing knowledge to younger generations. It was about learning from your family members. It was all these things that were connected to this one animal. And, caribou was not something that people just did for an afternoon outside the community, typically. Going on a caribou hunt was to typically go out onto the land for multiple days or potentially even weeks at a time. And so people felt like they really got connected to their lands, their surroundings, by going on these more in-depth caribou hunts. And so this was really something that people talked about a lot, on how important this animal was, more than just this food source. Another thing that people talked about were the positive emotions associated with the caribou experience.
It was what made me look forward to this time of year, to go into the country and look for the animals, to find them, like it just it brought happiness to everything. It made you feel special to be able to do that type of stuff. And then once you got the animal, when you're cutting it up the way you were taught as a child, the smell of the animal, the surroundings. But when you get home and then you prepare the meat and then you share it out with people, it was just, it was a feeling like no other.
A feeling like no other. It brought happiness to everything. And people talked about how by going on these collective experiences, by going out onto the land, people felt a lot of positive emotions with the caribou experience. And this came out through not just food, but again, the process of going out on the land, preparing the meat, of bringing it back and sharing it around to community members, feeling the excitement, the pride, the joy. Whoops. There were a lot of positive emotions that contributed to people's mental health and emotional well-being in communities. This was something that almost everyone talked about. But now that there have been these caribou population declines, as well as the total hunting ban that's been in place since 2013, there are a lot of negative implications that Inuit have been feeling, have been experiencing throughout the communities. So they talked about this in different ways.
I miss the hunt. I miss the meat. Miss everything about it. It's like I said, big part of who we are, our identity is taken away. Like so many other things that we have no control over.
People talked about how caribou was really a core part of who they were as individuals, as communities. And now that this thing that is part of who they are has been taken away through the ban, as well as the natural, the declines, people felt that there has been this alteration to their identities, the way that they perceive themselves. Because if caribou is part of them and that's not there anymore, what does that mean for themselves as individuals? And again, this was talked about not only at the individual level, but caribou was part of the collective history of these communities, collective heritage, overall community-based well-being. And so removing that animal and everything tied to that animal has had some pretty profound effects on Inuit identity and self-perception. And this is something that we wrote about in a recent paper published in Global Environmental Change about these kind of cultural and identity alterations that happen when something like a species is disconnected from people that are connected to that species. So that was one of the core things that people talked about. But there were also a lot of social implications from these caribou declines and the hunting ban.
I think one of the biggest impacts is the loss of caribou to the South Coast is you're not going from community to community so much as you used to one time. One time when there was a hunt on, you didn't necessarily just hunt. You take 2 or 3 men from your own community and go. You probably had people come from other communities, like 10 or 12 men go together from different communities and have a shared hunt and harvest and bring it home to the communities.
People talked about how important the caribou experience was for connecting different people together. That was at a family level. You went out with your father or your parents, your grandparents. At a community level, because you were going out with your neighbors and other community members, but also at the regional level, you were going between communities. But now that the caribou hunt has been banned, there have been a lot of influences on these social relationships. As mentioned, on these different levels, people aren't going out with their families as much on the land anymore. They're not going with different community members. And there have been some pretty big changes to regional relationships based on what Inuit were saying. Some people said that they had not even been to certain communities to see their friends or their family in years, because the reason to go beforehand was on these caribou hunts. And now that there aren't caribou hunts, there aren't those same reasons to go to these communities. So there are these social dimensions that, you know, I don't think were fully understood when something like this ban was put in place. Another aspect of these social kind of relationships and connections are these in-depth sharing networks that are part of these communities and part of the well-being of these communities, excuse me. And by sharing networks, it's related to food and knowledge sharing. And on the food side, you know, a lot of people when they go caribou hunting, it's not just for themselves or their family. Oftentimes, caribou meat is shared throughout the community to others that, you know, might not be able to afford to go on a hunt or whatever it might be. So now that there have been these changes, there are people reported that there was less sharing happening because you didn't have as much to share. With the caribou, you had a lot of meat, but now that you aren't having that big kind of bulk quantity of meat, there aren't those kinds of sharing relationships to the same extent that they were years before. So all to say, a lot of different social dimensions associated with the loss of caribou. And just as I mentioned earlier about some of the positive emotions that were tied to the caribou experience, the hunt, there have now been a lot of negative emotions described by Inuit.
Imagine that entire portion of the diet is gone and could never ever come back, you know. And it's almost haunted because when I look at the elders, that's my big worry is the elders. It's just like us saying the last few years of your life, you're only going to eat canned food, or you're only going to eat whatever. You become you feel that sense of sadness and stress and worry.
People talked about how emotional it was that the caribou were declining, and this came out through a variety of different negative emotional implications. People talked not only about sadness and stress, but also anxiety, frustration, grief, shock, and a variety of other distresses and negative emotions that people were feeling because of this thing that had been taken away from their lives. And it's important to note that these things are not just seen as kind of independent feelings. They're very much tied to the cultural aspects, the social aspects of going on a caribou hunt, of eating caribou with your family, of sharing it out with your community. All of these things are tied together. And one thing that almost every single person talked about up and down the coast was that there was a lot of concern with the ability for youth to learn the cultural knowledge, to learn the caribou specific information, to be able to pass that on for generations to come.
It's too bad that I couldn't get in on this, because now at my age I'm 16 and I would be helping Dad when he went in caribou hunting, and I would help him on his trips, and then I would learn. He would pass down that skill of caribou hunting to me, and I would get to see all the beautiful places inside Labrador, and I would get to experience the whole camping trip out in tent and hunting the caribou and shooting them and which way is best to do it, and then bringing it home to the family, to our family, right? And it's too bad that I missed it on this.
You know, in some ways, it was heartbreaking to hear about these youth who were trying to become connected to their culture and their land, and had the energy to do so, but they weren't able to do these things because the caribou are no longer able to be hunted. And so they're not learning these practices and the knowledge that has been part of their communities for generations and generations. And that in itself had a variety of implications. And you know, the way that I think some people might have longed for the past and longed for these happy memories with caribou, a lot of youth described longing for something that they had never actually done before. You know, there was this idea that you know, their parents, their grandparents had been caribou hunting for years, and they really wanted to do that, even though they had never actually done it before. And so there's a lot of these intergenerational challenges associated with this biodiversity loss, this loss of not only a species, but a culture related to it. And again, all these things are tied together. as that young man shared, Nicholas Flowers. This is something that he wanted to do, but he can't, and he wants to be an Inuit hunter, and this is something that Inuit hunters do. So these things are tied to identity and your self-perception, your sense of well-being. It's all connected. But it wasn't just the negative aspects that people talked about, even though, they're very sad and frustrated with these declines, the hunting ban. People also pointed to ways of moving forward. How are we going to actually move forward in ways that are Inuit led? And so this came out through a variety of means.
We should work together and for all the good of the people, because we only come through here once. And the caribou, if it's managed right, they'll be here for 1,000 years, or they will be selling 1,000 years from now. And I think that we all need to try and work together and not just think about today, think about tomorrow.
So people talked about the importance of working together. Caribou are an animal that crosses boundaries. They have large ranges, and many people are connected to this animal. And so there's a lot of emphasis on the need for collectively working across disciplines, across different cultural groups, across communities to support caribou. But also to really emphasize the importance of Inuit-led and other Indigenous-led strategies for caribou conservation in ways that aren't just about looking at the species as an independent animal, but rather something that's deeply connected to the health, the well-being, the culture of these communities. So Inuit-led strategies that are not just about the animal, but about the people as well. So as a whole, I hope this provided a glimpse into some of the complex and deep-rooted connections that Inuit have with caribou. Caribou are an important source of food and emotional well-being, culture, livelihoods. But now that there's been this change in caribou populations and restricted access to caribou because of the hunting ban, there are these disruptions that have happened to Inuit caribou relationships. And this is coming out through different implications for emotional well-being, for culture, identity, food security, and a variety of other means. So as mentioned at the start of this, this project was all about creating not just research work, but also documentary film work. And we are extremely excited because it's been 5+ years of working on this community-based documentary film, and it's finally released. It's on CBC Gem for anyone in Canada to watch for free. Obviously, we don't have time for that right now, but I thought I'd share a trailer so that you can get a little idea of what this film looks like.
The hillsides, you're just seeing everything moving with caribou.
They were so numerous. It's like the wildebeest in Africa.
It's something that us Inuit love and thrive on.
I suppose you would call it the staple. We had that every day.
We dried it, we celebrated it, we shared it. So it was a part of who we were.
Then after a while, you could almost feel more than observe. You feel it.
But who would ever think that our main source of food would disappear?
There's more bad news tonight about our vanishing caribou population. Terrible loss to me. Nothing replaces the caribou.
The loss of a food, a cultural food, is just as high of an importance as language, craft, and art.
Having a caribou hunt is one of the proudest things that a young man can say, is that they shot their first caribou. And now my generation don't have that option.
A big part of who we are, our identity, is taken so many other things.
It's almost like the caribou was the reason, and everything else happened after.
So I hope that provided a glimpse into the things that people are experiencing in Labrador because of these caribou population declines, the total hunting ban, and the importance for caribou for so many different people in these communities. This is something that we've been working on for a very long time, and the co-creation aspects of this work has been absolutely integral to getting to this point. So I'm excited to be sharing this work. I'm looking forward to any thoughts and questions that you might have about this work as well. But I hope you learned something from it, either from the health and well-being side or the visual communication side. And I'm happy to answer any questions at this point. Thank you very much for watching. And actually, I remember I was also going to share that for anyone that's interested, we've been working on, as important as this work has been in terms of the output, in terms of the film, equally important to that has been also the making of this work. And so we created a behind the scenes video that I'm going to post in the chat right now. And this is something, if you're interested in working on co-creation work, on visual communications with Indigenous communities, on storytelling in ways that are of value to community members, this link might be of use and of interest to you, because yeah, it's all about not just the final product, but the way that you got there. But yeah, I thought I'd just keep it open-ended right now and see if anyone has any questions. Thanks, Penny. Yes, the film is definitely available to view, and here I'll pull it up right now for you if anyone would like to take a look at that. All right, yeah, so that link I just posted in the chat, that should bring you to Herd, the film on CBC Gem. And you might need to set up an account. I'm not totally sure, but it should be free. And you can watch our 44-minute version of the film there. We also have put together a short film that's about 15 minutes long. That's currently being run through film festivals right now. But yeah, we're in the early stages of just getting this work out. I should mention that it only went live on CBC a few weeks ago. So this is really the start of us trying to get this work out and hopefully share more information with people around Canada. And thank you, Penny, for that. I appreciate you taking a look at our website. Thank you, Rafika. I apologize if I'm not saying that properly, but yeah, I guess your question relating to what other Inuit-led strategies outside of the hunting ban, that's a great question. I think that there's no one Inuit strategy. You know, we talked to over 80 people, and people had a lot of different opinions on what should be happening or what could be done better. But I think one common thread was that people didn't want it to be an open season. People didn't want to just be able to go and hunt as many caribou as they wanted. That's not something that people were keen on, but rather they wanted the ability to not be completely cut off from the caribou herd. And you know, everyone recognizes that the herds are at a very low population, at least comparing to what they were before. But there's still room for some form of hunt that can help bridge the cultural information and knowledge that's needed for not only the well-being of communities, but also the future of caribou conservation. And so I think a lot of people were saying that even, you know, one caribou per community per year would be at least a little bit of caribou, not from the food side. Obviously you might get, you know, a few bites for the community, but it's more so the ability of bringing out elders and hunters with youth, going on that caribou hunt, learning what to look out for, where to go on the land, what caribou to pick for the health of the herd, and bringing that back to the community. And this is the kind of information that is so important for the future of both the herds and the communities into the future. So that's one idea of how people wanted to move forward with this. Thanks for that question. I'm not sure if anyone is currently working on any kind of creative aspect or is interested in co-creation work, but I'd be curious to hear. You can just put in the chat, if any of you are working on any kind of visual media, storytelling, maybe photography or something like that you feel you want to, have it have an actual impact. Okay, yeah, that's no problem. One question I wanted to pose to everyone that's still on. Oh, sorry, I don't know if Brenda, you have a question. All right. Well, yeah, one question I wanted to pose to everyone was, caribou is clearly something that is so important for Inuit. But while I was doing this work and listening in on people's experiences, I was having trouble thinking about, what is the one thing that if that was taken away from me, I would have these kinds of emotional, cultural implications. And so I'm curious to hear from everyone, what is your caribou? What is the thing, whether it's, an ecological aspect, maybe it's an animal, maybe it's a, some kind of river, or it could be totally open-ended. But what is your caribou? What is that thing that you feel is deeply connected to your culture and identity? And I'd be curious to hear in the chat if you'd rather not share, that's totally fine as well. But I think it's something important for people to reflect on, and as a way to connect to some of these stories that otherwise might seem like far off places with far off people. Thank you. Dustin, I'll answer your question in just a moment, but I appreciate that comment, Rafika, about the lake in your hometown in Turkey and its water level decreasing. That's a really interesting point. I've talked to other people that have watched the film so far and related their experience to a particular lake or river or waterway, and how important that was for their community and their overall well-being. And if that was taken away, what does that mean for themselves? So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And then Paul, growing up on a small family farm, seeing the decline of the small farm is heartbreaking. Yeah, absolutely. I know that's a big feeling for many people. Yeah, Des, I think a lot of people actually in Labrador related the loss of caribou to the loss of cod, and that moratorium that was placed, back in the 90s. It's a very similar experience, one marine, one terrestrial, but people being completely disconnected from something that was just part of who they were in their lives. Thank you for sharing these. I'd be curious to hear anyone else that might have any thoughts on that as well. But in the meantime, I'm going to quickly answer Dustin's question. So with regards to funding, yeah, so that there were a lot of different groups involved in this. As mentioned, the Nunatsiavut government, NunatuKavut Community Council, the Torngat Secretariat, and all of them provided a certain level of in-kind funding to make this work possible. But we also got, because this project was research-based, we got most of our funding from academic avenues. So from SSHRC, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, provided the bulk of the funding, because we were, still writing articles. And really all of this work, including the film, was was part of my doctoral work. So this was very much framed as a community-based research project that had film as an output from it. We also had funding from Polar Knowledge Canada, from the Canadian Mountain Network, a few other channels that supported this. So it did take quite a bit of funding though to do a project like this in depth. Thanks for that question. Yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts or any particular connections that they feel might resonate? Maybe not with Caribou, but something else? Yeah, thank you, Brenda, for sharing that. That's really interesting. Yeah, and yeah, I guess hydro in particular in northern, well, Labrador, but especially Quebec, you know, that plays a big role in all of this, and it's complicated. The way that, you know, the caribou are declining. Some people were very much against hydro. Others were saying that it wasn't related, but clearly all these things are connected and need to be thought about when thinking about biodiversity loss and also people's livelihoods to be able to, you know, still live in these communities. But thanks for your thoughts. Maybe if people are still, you know, thinking about some of their own personal reflections, I have another question for everyone, and that's what creative co-creation methods have you already used or are potentially interested in? And if this isn't relevant to you and your work, then that's totally fine. But you know, I don't know if people are interested in a particular type of creative practice, whether it's, you know, maybe graphical work or podcasting or photography or video in this case, and how this is connected to sharing social, environmental stories alongside Indigenous communities. So yeah, any thoughts there? Any interests? All right, yeah. If there's no additional thoughts, then that's totally fine as well. If there are, then you know I'm happy to stay on for the next 10 to 15 minutes if people have additional questions. But these were kind of the questions I thought I'd raise to people. If you do have any interest in reaching out or potentially having a film screening or want to follow up with this work, feel free to reach out to me. I'm gonna put my information in right now. Feel free to email me at any point. And yeah, I guess you have the behind the scenes video, you've got the film that we've created, you've got my contact, the website. So, you know, if you're interested in this work, please follow up. And otherwise, I really, really appreciate you listening in on this work.